understanding the context of the situation is key for making pricing decisions. Understand the customer's viewpoint, understands the competitors that are involved in that situation, even outside influences as much as you can, a consultant or not, right? I think those are the key things, and I think those are what people should think about when they're pricing.
Coffee's for closers only.
So we've established my proposal is sound in principle. Now we're just haggling over price.
Let's see how much we're going for on eBay.
Man, it's the same as Dunkin' Donuts. Costs 15 times the price.
Welcome to Impact Pricing, the podcast where we discuss pricing, value, and the indexed relationship between them. I'm Mark Stiving, and my mission is to help your company win more business at higher prices. And today our guest is Scott Miller. Here are three things you want to know about Scott before we start. He is a VP of pricing at Fiserv. He manages a huge team of pricing folks. Okay, he said large, I said huge. And he's been in pricing for 12 years now, so he's been around the block. And by the way, he also plays the trumpet. Welcome, Scott.
Hey, Mark, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's always fun to talk about pricing, and I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot today.
Oh, I'm sure I am too. So standard question, 12 years ago, how did you get into pricing?
Okay, that is a really good question. So I had worked at Motorola for quite a while in various roles. There's an individual in the mobile phone division, Neil Brisbane. And Neil Brisbane was kind of the genesis of pricing. He was my mentor in getting started. He gave me my first strategy and tactics of pricing book, right? So he was part of the Professional Pricing Society. You know, he knew all the ins and outs and nuts and bolts and everything. And so he gave me that opportunity in pricing and that chance to realize what a great career it could be for me. And his team branched off into many different areas, right? I know people that I was originally there doing pricing and consulting work across many different industries. So I really have to give a shout out to Neil for getting everything started.
So you had a different role and he just offered you a job in pricing and you said, yes, I'm going to take a job in pricing.
That's exactly right. So wow. I was at the time doing something a little bit more along the lines of the supply chain. And Neil had an opening and came and talked to me about it. And I thought it was a great opportunity because what still interests me about pricing today is it's kind of a left brain, right brain kind of activity where, you know, you can go through the nuts and bolts and the logic and the facts of the financials and why it does or doesn't make sense. But at the same time, there's that creative aspect. And I think that maybe ties back a little bit to my background in music, where you're thinking about how is the customer going to react to this? And are we presenting ourselves like we should? And, you know, does it have a dollar sign or not? I mean, you can get into the little nitpicky details, right? And that's what I really like about it.
Yeah, there's so much that's going on. It's just fascinating. Now,
Absolutely.
I find your story interesting because I don't know if I've ever heard somebody tell me that story in 153 of these podcasts so far.
Well, good. I'm glad I did something original. Great.
Almost always, it's somebody got thrown into a pricing project and realized how much power there was and said, oh, I'm going to stick with this.
So no, right? It was an established, organized team under Neil. And I think it was kind of forward because at the time he was direct right to the CEO of that business. So we weren't part of finance, we weren't part of product. We were sort of the police in the middle trying to run down that line of, you know, the product people pushing for margin on their product and the sales people pushing for the lowest possible price in the market. And so it was a great experience, really got me started.
Nice. So what did you learn back then when you were, what do you think the big trick was that said, okay, now I think I'm starting to understand what pricing really means?
Well, you know, I'm not sure I still know exactly what pricing means, Mark. I did get the chance to get introduced to a lot of different concepts in that start there at Motorola, right? Because although we weren't directly selling to a customer, it wasn't really B2C, right? We were selling into carriers, you know, your AT&Ts, your Verizons, et cetera. But it was always with that end price point in mind. Back in those dark ages, it was the carriers that were subsidizing the phone. You can probably remember when you could go out and get a $0 phone if you signed up for a contract, right, with Verizon. And so when we were selling into Verizon, we were targeting those retail price points. So you kind of had to think through it in a two-step process. You know, how much can we realize on the price? Where will that end up at retail? What kind of volume? Will they put this into some kind of promotion where it's normally 99, but they'll sell it at 49 at Christmas? And so it was a lot of that stuff. We talked about rebates and the breakage on rebates, right? How much is it really going to cost us to do a $100 rebate, et cetera. So it was a lot of exposure quickly to a lot of different concepts. And the life cycle was really short, right, on a mobile phone. It was maybe 12 or 18 months. And it wasn't like a big SKU count. Yeah, 30 maybe, right? I mean, it really wasn't a whole lot to keep track of as far as that was concerned, but it was a lot of exposure to a lot of cool concepts.
Okay, first question. How much does a $100 rebate cost you?
Oh,
I'm
you
really
know, that's
curious.
good. You know,
Is it more or less than 100? That's
oh,
my
it's
question.
much less. It's much less, right? So that's the whole thing behind rebates, right? So if you offer a $50 or $100 rebate, you have the back history of how many people actually fill out the paperwork or do whatever it takes to get the rebate, right? And it's far less than you'd even imagine. I think on a $50 rebate, it was maybe 19%. So when we did the, you know, okay, how much is going to cost us, we used that historical numbers that we had right from the past rebate and just kind of apply it to the cost breakout and what we expected to get in lift.
Yeah, the thing that's interesting about a rebate, besides the fact that it doesn't get used by everybody who uses it to make their decision, is that you're taking the profit hit from the consumer's price, not from the price you sold to the dealer.
That's exactly right. You're right. And of course, there's a lot of things involved in that, right? How much inventory, how much you're trying to move, where is this in the life cycle, right? There's a lot of thought going into that. But yeah, it is absolutely. And we weren't setting up rebates. I'm sure people have heard stories that it's a horror show to fill out the paperwork or anything. It was nothing like that. It was just people hearing it at purchase and then just sort of forgetting about it and not actually applying for the rebate.
Nice. One of the things that I heard you say as you were talking about selling to carriers and consumers is a way that I don't think many people think. And that is that we as pricing people or we as companies, we actually have two different customers. Right? We have the end user as a customer. We have to understand what's the price point they're willing to pay, how do they perceive value, how are they looking at it, and then we've got that carrier, or in a lot of businesses you might call that a distribution channel. Right. So my distribution channel has to make a decision. Am I going to carry your product or a competitor's product? And which am I going to push at what point in time? So we're really and truly thinking about value for two different customers.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's a great point. And it was super visible in Motorola, right? Because it was right there in front of your face because of those basically locked in retail price points. You never saw something for 75 or, you know, I mean, they were all 49, 69, 99, 129, right? So it was right there for you every time you were looking at it. I think it gets a little gray, right? In the current position, we're selling something that almost works like an operating system with some add-ons, and then their end user is paying a certain amount, but it gets lost a lot. It's not as clean. But you're right, it really is more than just a one-step process on the sell-in price.
Yes. So where did you go from Motorola? Did you make the
From
leap to Fiserv?
Motorola, yeah, I transitioned to a medical devices company called Hollister Incorporated. And I don't know if you're aware of the mall store Hollister, but when I first told my family that had taken a position with Hollister, my daughter got super excited about it. And I had I had to break the unfortunate news that it was a medical devices company. It was not the mall store. And they sell ostomy, incontinence, and wound and critical care. So it was a big switch, right? Not only in who we were selling to, but how we were selling. So you've got basically two markets, at least there were at Hollister. There were sales to hospitals, and then there were sales to people that left the hospital and still need the product. So you had big purchasing organizations with longer term contracts that were set up with various tiers based on volumes, and your larger hospital systems either had their own purchasing organizations or members of those. So you go through that whole contracting cycle where you're rebidding, right, to get the business. And especially for that ostomy product that had that strong after leaving the hospital sales, you had to think about, you know, the sell into there was creating, and you know, sticky is probably the wrong, way to term this, but a person that used that in the hospital was like almost 100% going to use it when they left the hospital, right? So it was really important to sell into the hospital market. And then you had that distributor market that would then sell to people in their homes. And you had to think about like Medicare and reimbursement and stuff. So it was a whole different thing, as far as what to think about and how to price, and exposed to a lot of other factors like insurance, how much they were going to cover. And then the actual SKU count was much larger than, of course, in Motorola. I went from maybe 30 SKUs to probably like 700, 800 SKUs for that medical devices business.
Yeah, 700 is still not a lot of SKUs. I
It
deal
is
with hundreds
not.
of thousands of
It
SKUs.
seemed like a lot, right? Leaving Motorola, it seemed like a lot, but you're absolutely right. It's not a whole bunch.
Yeah. So I don't know if I'm jealous or glad that it was you and not me, but when people ask me what do I price, I often say anything except government and medical. And I and I try to avoid medical because insurance confuses the heck out of me when I'm trying to do it for it myself, let
Yeah.
alone trying to understand how they're going to compensate and who's making what decisions. It's like
Sure.
that's a black box as far as I'm
Sure,
concerned.
absolutely. It was also exposure to MFC and things like that, right? And we were selling to the VA, and the government demands the best price. So there was plenty of back and forth on what's going on, how are we pricing this contract versus others? How do we set up some kind of guardrails so that we can call this MFC for this situation, but it's not that situation, right?
Yeah.
So again, a ton of stuff learned in a different environment.
Nice, nice. Okay, next step. This is actually fun, walking through your career.
Well, that's good to hear. So I was back at Motorola then. After I was a Hollister, I went back to Motorola in a global role. And so now I was talking to Europe and Africa and pricers across the globe, similar products, but where were they trying to sell in their market? What was their ASP? What was their floor price? And how do we deal with low pricing to get into an emerging market, not coming back via like black market into where we're getting a higher price point? So it was a whole different exposure to things on a global international scale. And it was super enjoyable too. I really, really liked doing the global role and the exchange rates and figuring all of that out.
So we economists like to call that, we use the word arbitrage, right? Someone buying at a low price and reselling it at a higher price. How did you stop it? What are some of the tricks you could use?
We didn't have a ton of tricks. I'd love to give you like some silver bullet on how we stopped that, but mostly it was just paying attention to our own selling price. I don't know if they legally tried to get after some people that were doing the black market type of activities, but there wasn't a clean answer that we had at the time.
I know when I've been involved in situations like that, not identical, but situations like that, we tried to stop selling to the people who weren't doing it the right way.
Right.
So it's
right.
kind of like you have to earn the right to sell the product.
Yeah. And that was part of it, right? But they were buying off of carriers that they'd be in India or somewhere. And so they'd get the price that they needed in India, but of course it was still below what we were selling it in Europe. And so it was always a little bit of a balance, trying to balance between making sure we were encouraging sales in some of those areas, but not cannibalizing our own sales in other regions.
So let's talk about currency for a second. The big problem with currency is who's taking the currency risk. The risk of currency fluctuations.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think through that problem, and who makes the decision, or how does the decision get made?
Well, at the time at Motorola, we took most of the currency risk, right? Because we priced in the local currency. So the fluctuations would hit our bottom line, right? And that, I assume, was just a conscious decision by, the greater organization, that they weren't going to try and fluctuate prices to regions based on, again, like the exchange rates. So we didn't deal with it from the other side of trying to put the risk on the customers. We took the risk.
And so, it's kind of interesting because right now we're in inflationary times. I could imagine that if you're selling into a country and there's a large currency fluctuation, that your competitors are also getting hit with that same currency fluctuation.
Absolutely, unless your competitor is in that region, right?
Is local, yes.
Yeah,
And so then you have a little bit more flexibility to say, look, we're going to increase prices or to cover some of that extra cost it took us.
sure, sure.
So
So
nice.
that was a great time. I enjoyed working at Motorola. I left there and I went to a company called Airgas. I don't know if you're familiar with Airgas, but it's a US-based company for the most part that uh, grew up with like gas sales, right? Like oxygen, nitrogen, et cetera, and added welding supplies and safety supplies. So that was what you would call, I think, at least a somewhat larger SKU count, right? Because if you're talking different types of gas and different size cylinders, and you're talking about safety items all the way from safety cones to latex gloves, right? So quite a catalog. Now we're talking up in the thousands for sure of SKUs. And I again, learned a lot of stuff there, not just on the SKU count, but that was where I got a lot of exposure to something we had touched on a little earlier, which was a formula kind of pricing or index pricing that gets launched into the contracts. Because you're locked into a contract, you can't necessarily just change the price of an item to a customer. So we'd have language in the contract to basically follow a mix of PPI, trying to kind of hit a balance of how the customer viewed our cost base. So you might have 34% of the increase based on a PPI for gas, and 33% based on transportation, and 33% based on labor, let's say, just an example. And so then you just took the year over year for each of those indices and you balance it out by, the formula of 34, 30, 33, and that ended up being the contract increase for the year.
Okay, so I got to tell you, that rubs me the wrong way.
Okay.
And here's
is
why.
that?
Here's why. What you just described sounds to me like cost plus pricing.
Okay. And fair, but maybe not exactly.
Okay.
So we have a price point, right, that we're selling in that in theory is disconnected from cost, right? So we maybe are selling, let's say, safety gloves for $1, right? What are costs below that? It is irrelevant to the dollar, more or less, right? That's what we think we can get. That's what we agreed on. What we're saying is that dollar we're charging is going to increment up by the change in that index. So we're just kind of raising price over time. It's not really tied to cost. It is somewhat tied to what we're saying our underlying costs are. So that's where I see you making the connection. Cost plus, kind of, maybe not.
Well, no. So I think your answer was right, and I would have given that had you not given it.
Well, thanks for that.
So here's what I think is really going on is that, whatever the cost happens to be of those materials, doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
You have some value add on top of that you're able to charge for. Mm-hmm. And so we are charging for value. We know what a customer is willing to pay.
Yes.
And all we've done is pre-establish that as costs fluctuate, your price fluctuates.
Yes.
But it turns out we're still getting that chunk of value on top.
That's right. And you're incrementing that value, right? By whatever that index is too. So yeah, at the end of the day, you do realize some cost increases on a longer term contract that hopefully both you and the customer can live with.
Yes. And I've written a few blogs about this topic in a different way recently, and I'd just love to hear your thought. And the concept is the companies who sell credits. So typically they're AWS SaaS type companies, AWS based SaaS type companies, and they're selling their product using credits instead of, here's what it costs for this capability. And so you buy enough, it's like tokens at the arcade, right? I'm going to buy tokens and stick them into the machine instead of putting dollars into the machine or quarters into the machine. And I think they do this because they're trying to cover their costs of AWS. They don't know what their customers' AWS usage is going to be. And so they create these credits to make sure they've covered those costs.
And you don't think that the AWS cost is any kind of a pass through to that customer?
No, I'm pretty sure it's not.
Okay.
But what my recommendation is pass through the AWS costs, right? Take a 10% margin on it just for the hassle of doing it.
Yep.
and
Yep.
charge for the value on top of AWS that you put in.
And that's what I have been exposed to, talking about cloud-based,
Mhm.
software as a service, is that part of it is viewed as more of a pass-through, right? There may be some little margin bit on the top of that just because it's a hassle, or you're doing the invoicing or whatever, but it's often seen as just a pass-through cost. So I guess I'm in agreement with you that that's the best to stick with that.
Cool. So what are some pitfalls? I haven't done too much with index pricing like that.
Yeah.
What are some pitfalls that people have to look out for if they're going to start looking into something like this?
Sure. Obviously, the formula itself, coming up with something that's agreeable to both parties, you have to be kind of specific in how it lays out in the contract to make sure if for any reason that index goes negative on you, which could happen, right? Things change. You want to make sure that that's not a price break, right? That this is only 0 or up. It's not, now we're going to start cutting costs because the indexes went under. So you got to be careful of that. And I would also
Well, how do you get so if I'm a buyer and you tell me we need to cover the cost increases, I'm going to say, well, why don't I get to take advantage of the cost decreases?
Well, and you can make that case before you ever have this discussion about PPI, right? I think there's an underlying assumption in almost every business that you're cutting costs by like 3% a year, right? I think that's the standard that people kind of wash across everything. So, they're always going to assume that, right? I think we're talking about, what our increases, not just to our costs, but, investment to get back into the products, et cetera, that we're trying to wrap into some of this pricing and price increase discussion. It's not just a bare cost discussion. So although we're tying it to a cost, we're not saying it's just our underlying costs that are increasing. That makes sense?
Yep, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. So
But
the
it
one
sounds like it
other
has to
thing
be
I would
communicated well.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And I would also suggest that people try to do it on a calendar date rather than like a 12-month from contract date, because you get into the business of constantly running, right? These calculations. If you can get away with just doing it once a year, then maybe you're just looking at the labor cost once and the transportation cost, right? Depending on how you built those formulas. Otherwise, you're redoing it every time the contract comes due.
Yeah, that sounds interesting for long-term contracts. And I've heard that chemical type industries do this a lot.
Yeah, I think it's really used a lot in chemical type of industries. That's my understanding. But that was obviously not where I was. But maybe the gas influence was, part
Yeah.
of why that was part of those contracts.
Yeah, so I've been in semiconductors quite a bit, and it wasn't uncommon for us if we had a part that used a lot of gold and we were using a relatively big contract, as we'd have a
Oh, sure.
gold index
Mhm.
kicker in there,
Yep,
just
that
so that
makes
if the
total
price of
sense.
gold skyrocketed, we didn't get hit.
Sure,
But
that makes
but the
sense.
fascinating thing, and I'll point this out to all of our listeners, what that means is that we're putting the risk on our customers.
Yes, it does, somewhat,
And
right? A
right,
limited amount of risk, but yes. And of course, it's all in how you do this, Mark, right? I mean, I've been involved in contracts where it's tied to an index or a flat, 3% or, whichever is less.
mhm.
So sometimes that risk gets mitigated during negotiation somewhat.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Okay, so where'd you go next? When do you make it
So
to Fiserv?
how did I make the Fiserv? Well,
Where-
that's the beauty of LinkedIn, right? So I had a recruiter reach out to me from Fiserv. I had no idea what the company was when they reached out to me. I thought it was Pfizer, who we all know now, right, for the shots and
Yes.
everything. And I went and had a discussion with them. And the headquarters happened to be local to where I was working for Airgas. And I just thought it was fascinating, again, an opportunity to start pricing software. So not only was it getting into more of the technology, where I kind of cut my teeth back with Motorola, but it was a chance to look at pricing something that at the time I just really had no concept of, okay, how do you price a license, right? To where it makes sense. How do you price hosting software to people, and et cetera. And so I just looked at it, like I said, a great learning opportunity, and I jumped at the chance to get involved. And I've been very fortunate in my time at Fiserv. I've seen a lot of things, gotten to do a lot of exciting things.
So one of the things I find interesting about pricing software is it essentially has zero cost. Now that's not really true, but it's pretty close to true. And if you think about everything that you did prior to this, it was a physical product.
That's
And so there
correct.
was real hard costs, and we had to make sure that we were covering costs. And so you could have excused, and I say that horribly, cost plus pricing mentality.
Mhm.
As soon as you shift to software, if there's no cost, how do you do cost plus?
You're absolutely right. You're right.
And
It's a
so,
different ball game in software for sure.
yeah. And so, what do you think? I know companies do this. What do you think of companies who take all of their overhead costs, their development costs, and divide it by the number of units they're going to say, and say, this is our standard cost for our product? And now you're being graded on margin. Oh, wait, I might be asking too specific of a
You
question.
might be getting a little specific here. Let's say I've seen that kind of thinking for sure. Um, and I would not, and I know you weren't trying to, set some kind of absolute. There certainly are costs involved with software. If you're hosting, suddenly you're in the ballpark of hard costs, right? You have a data center somewhere, it has to be staffed, et cetera, right? So it's a little more obvious, at least in that kind of environment, not just the cost, but then you've got a value story, right, that you're putting on top of it, which was something I helped develop some modeling. So we go out to customers and tell them, right, okay, this is why you're going to pay more for this, but look at all these benefits you get, right? Standard value setup. With the in-house and license, that obviously is a little bit different. And I think in some ways we get to piggyback on software licensing since day one. It's basically been set up, right, in a certain format. Here's your license, here's your maintenance, and that's like an industry standard. And the cost side of it doesn't often come directly in the conversation. It's more of an internal, how do we determine how much money we're actually making in this situation, right? What are we going to call as a cost for a license versus not a cost for a license? And I think that's where it gets a little trickier.
Yeah. Okay. Scott, I've been having so much fun with this, but we're going to end with the final question.
Okay.
Given your 12 years of experience in so many different places, what's one piece of pricing advice you would give our listeners that you think could have a big impact on their business?
I think context. I think the context of the situation rules many discussions that I have, at least for sure currently. And then you can use that old adage of the life preserver right now, or if you're on the Titanic, right? A whole different story on what that is worth to you. And so I think understanding the context of the situation is key for making pricing decisions, to understand, the customer's viewpoint, understands the competitors that are involved in that situation, even outside influences as much as you can, a consultant or not, right? I think those are the key things. And I think those are what people should think about when they're pricing.
Nice. So I'm going to repeat what you said using words that I think you'll agree with.
Okay.
And that is every buyer, every purchase situation, the buyers perceive value differently. And our job needs to be to understand what the value is that each buyer is perceiving.
I like that. I think you stated that very well, Mark.
Nice. I appreciate that. Scott, thank you so much. This has been a blast. If anybody wants to contact you, how can they do that?
LinkedIn would be best, right? And I think, Mark, we're going to tag that in the notes on the discussion, right?
Yeah, we'll put the URL in the show notes so it'll be easy to find you, and people can send you messages or so perfect. Episode 153 is all done. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this, would you please leave us a rating and a review? And finally, if you have any questions or comments about the podcast or pricing in general, feel free to email me, mark@impactpricing.com. Now, go make an impact.